Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library Museum. My name is Bill Barabalt, and I'm the president of the Richard Nixon Foundation. We are very pleased to have 7 representatives from NATO countries in our audience today. Admiral Stavridis was, of course, Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, and commanded Allied Command Operations for NATO. Please join me in welcoming Pavla Slipak, Consul General of the Czech Republic in Los Angeles. André Vantiem, Consul General of Belgium in Los Angeles. Mariusz Bajmora, Consul General of Poland in Los Angeles. Catherine Steinbrenner, Deputy Consul General of Germany in Los Angeles. And I apologize if I mispronounced this, but Gerti Minas Surika, Deputy Consul General of Lithuania in Los Angeles. And Teresa Pedres, Education Specialist from the Spanish Consulate General in Los Angeles. Thank you for all being with us today. And we are also joined by 6 Naval Sea Cadets members from the Escondido Battalion. They could stand to be honored. To begin our program, please welcome Blue Eagle Color Guard from March Air Force Base for the presentation of the colors. And please welcome Elisa Solario, who will sing the national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Please be seated. Thank you to the Blue Eagles Color Guard from March Air Force Base and Elisa Solario. And a special thank you for the docents that are here today helping us with our visitors. Richard Nixon was a Navy man. Although he had exemptions as a birthright Quaker and a married man, he felt the need to serve his country. He went to Naval OCS and initially served at a naval air station in Iowa. But not satisfied with that, he applied several times for combat service and was eventually transferred to the South Pacific the last 2 years of the war. His naval service is honored and his uniform is displayed in our new Nixon Library. And we invite you all to visit our new presentation of this presidency. There is also a direct Nixon legacy connection between Richard Nixon and our current day volunteer military. Martin Anderson was a Nixon alum and a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University till he passed away in 2015. An engineer by training and an esteemed academic, his work spanned urban renewal, welfare reform, and the military draft. He was Richard Nixon's 1968 presidential campaign director of research. That work included the drafting and promotion of the all-volunteer force following the 1968 election. President Nixon and Martin Anderson teamed in conscription in the United States. It is my pleasure now to introduce our featured speaker, a volunteer career naval officer who served his country for 37 years. Admiral James Stavridis is one of the most admired men of his generation. His storied naval career makes him a subject matter expert on the power and prestige of the U.S. Navy, the subject of his latest book, Sea Power. Admiral Stavridis was appointed Supreme Allied Commander, Europe in 2009, overseeing all Allied command operations for NATO. He led NATO through a significant period of strategic realignment. His career has now taken him to academia as the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Massachusetts. He is also a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, associate fellow of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and chairman of the U.S. Naval Institute. There's even a story that he floated a career in politics, but he claims, "My name is too long for a bumper sticker." Admiral Stavridis, welcome to the new Nixon Library.
Thank you. Thank you, very kind. Well, first of all, many, many thanks, Bill, for that marvelous introduction, and thanks to all who have organized this absolutely terrific event today. And also, I want to particularly say, as was already done, to my honor to the consul generals of the various nations that are represented here. As a former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, when I walk in and see a lot of flags and the NATO flag, I feel pretty good. So what I thought I would talk about today is the subject of this book that I've just written. I'm going to take about 20 minutes, and we're going to go on a voyage together. And we're going to do it very briskly. We're going to get through all 7 seas in the course of the next 20 minutes, maybe 25. And then we'll open it up for some questions and comments and some thoughts about sea power. Let me just begin with this. I hope I'm going to begin. I am pressing the right button, Chris. Can we go to the next slide? There you go. So I'm going to start with just an overview for you. All of you, unless you are really deep water mariners, as am I, you look at this map and you immediately focus on the land. And yet 70%, 70% of the world's surface is covered by the oceans. In fact, you could take all of the land in the world, compress it, and it would fit inside the Pacific Ocean. 70%, by the way, of your body is composed of water. And 70% of the oxygen that you breathe comes from the oceans, from photosynthesis in the oceans. So I'm going to try and make the case today that the oceans matter because of our alliances and geopolitics, because of trade. 95% of all international trade flows across these oceans, and because of the environment, which is a danger looming ahead of us. Let's start with the Pacific. Let's get underway. This is a 1589 chart of the Pacific, almost 500 years old, this piece of paper. You can see the discontinuities, the irregularities of the mapping. But I want to focus you bottom right on the voyages of the Polynesians who got in small craft about the size, the length of 2 of these seating rows and sailed 5,000 miles. These are true mariners who crossed the Pacific 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. The Pacific is an ancient sea. It's the largest ocean on Earth. You don't have to remember these numbers, 150 million square kilometers. And when we look at the Pacific, we ought to remember that ancient mariners sailed these seas. Here are 2 ships. One, the bottom one, the small one, you'll know this ship, that's the Santa Maria, as in the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, the 3 ships that Christopher Columbus sailed. It was 60 feet long. That enormous behemoth behind it, built in the same year, was the Chinese flagship of Admiral Zheng He. It was 500 feet long, almost 10 times the size. It had 5 decks and 400 sailors manned it. So these Pacific waters have been plied by the Polynesians, the Chinese, the Japanese. Eventually, the United States comes to this region. And this is the iconic view that most Americans have of the Pacific, right? It comes out of the Second World War, when we had more aircraft carriers, hundreds, than we do ships in our Navy today. This view of the Pacific and the American entry in it really begins during the Second World War. But there's a new power rising in the Pacific. After centuries of leaning out of geopolitics, China is very much leaning in. These are Chinese ballistic missile submarines. China fields an extremely capable Navy, one that is gaining in both technology and quantity on the United States. And they are traveling with this Navy. Here is a proud Chinese Navy warship pulling in for a port visit in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Now, this is an area of water that is a subset of the Pacific Ocean. In the book, I talk about the Pacific broadly, and then I kind of zone in on the South China Sea. This area, which is enormous, is claimed by China. They claim that entire area, from China down through Vietnam, by Thailand, all the way across to the Philippines and up to Taiwan. That is the South China Sea. China is trying to establish a territorial claim here. It is a preposterous claim. It has been rejected by the international courts. But China wants to control this area because there are hydrocarbons underneath the water, billions of barrels of oil, trillions of square feet of natural gas, and secondly, they want it because they can control those shipping routes. If those are internal waters of China, they have control over them, and 80% of the trade in this region flows through that South China Sea. Next slide. So to reinforce their claims, China is building artificial islands throughout this region. You may have heard of this. They're basically taking sand, dumping it on top of coral reefs and militarizing it, putting airstrips, operating missiles, bringing their soldiers there, creating a case that they own those waters. This would be as though the United States claimed the Gulf of Mexico and all of the hydrocarbons and all of the land inside it. It does not wash in international law. Next slide. And therefore, we are working with our allies in the region. This is Japan. That's the Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. We are working with both Japan, South Korea, to push back on these Chinese claims. So one big geopolitical activity that is occurring is this claim of the South China Sea. But on the other hand, with China, we have a mutual problem that we have to work on together. and his name is Kim Jong-un. And he's very well named Kim Jong-un because he's unpredictable and he's unstable and he's addicted to opioids. He's morbidly obese. He's got a really bad haircut, as you can see. And he already has nuclear weapons, and he's increasing his ability to deliver them at range. So the geopolitics of the Pacific, building on that history I described for you, is both challenge with China, but also the need for cooperation with China. The Pacific will be an important ocean for us as we look at the world seas. Next slide. Let's turn to the Atlantic. This is the northern Atlantic, which has been a kind of a transit zone of history. It really, the Atlantic becomes part of our historical frame, next slide, because of exploration, the age of exploration, which begins on the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain. These are, by and large, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian explorers. Bottom right, most of you will recognize Christopher Columbus. Upper right is Prince Henry, the navigator who built this cadre. Upper left is Magellan, the greatest of the exploring navigators. Bottom left is Bartholomew Diaz, who many of you will not have heard of, but he was the one who essentially discovered the Indian Ocean. Next slide. So what's the mental frame of the United States in the Atlantic? It is the First and Second World War, when we protect the convoys that support our efforts in Europe. And this battle of the Atlantic goes on, and just as we think of the Pacific in terms of carrier battle groups ranging across the Pacific, we tend to think of the Atlantic as our convoy operations, which contributed greatly to our ability with our allies to win the 2 world wars. Next, please. Today, we are challenged in the Atlantic by Russia. And this challenge is in the old Cold War zones, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which is a water space between the United States and Europe. We see President Putin rebuilding the Russian fleet. After the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet fleet was broken up. Putin has now rebuilt that fleet, and we see very modern warships like this. This is the Admiral Grigorievich operating off the coast of Syria. So the Atlantic will become a zone of competition and hopefully not conflict between the United States, our NATO allies, and Russia. Where else shall we sail? Next slide. Let's go to the Indian Ocean. This is the 3rd largest ocean after the Pacific and the Atlantic. The Indian Ocean has been very quiet over the centuries. Why? Because India has not exerted itself. That too is changing. India is building a very capable fleet. Next slide. And you will see these are the flags of India and Pakistan. You'll see that rivalry begin to play itself out in the Indian Ocean. You'll also see piracy. These are the famous pirate lanes off the coast of Africa in the Indian Ocean. And you'll see more activity off the coast of Yemen, where Iran is entering into a great deal of effort to overthrow a Sunni government in Yemen. Next slide. That's the flag of Iran. As this century unfolds, you'll see competition between India and Iran in this Indian Ocean. And the Iranian vision is much like this. This is the Persian Empire at its greatest extent. Iran's self-view tends to be this, one of a regional hegemon, a regional power. Therefore, look at all that water space opening into the Indian Ocean. We'll see Iran operating there. And it will be a competition between Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia, 2 blocks. Israel, our closest ally in the region, parked in the middle of it. And a lot of it will unfold in that Arabian Gulf on the right side of this slide. So Indian Ocean, you'll see more big geopolitics as well as tactical conflict in this Persian Gulf. Next. So let's go to the Mediterranean. Now, we think of today the Mediterranean as a fairly peaceful place. It is the most warlike maritime region of the world over the course of 2,000 years. War at sea was invented in the Mediterranean. 2,500 years ago, the Persian fleet attacks Greece. From that point forward, the history of the Mediterranean is war at sea. If I could snap my fingers and bring back to life all of the mariners who died there in wars and bring back all of those hulls, those ships, you could walk across the Mediterranean Sea. Today, the principal challenge is in the eastern Mediterranean, the far right side of the Mediterranean. Why? Because the dictator of Syria, Assad, has driven 7 million people outside the borders of his country, and many of them have gone to sea. This eastern Mediterranean is very much a maritime zone of real disaster operations today. It looks like this. Vast refugee crafts still moving across these waters. Big U.S. and Russian warships interspersed. And let me just zone in and picture yourself on this refugee craft. That one on the right. Picture yourself on that vessel. So let's come a little closer to home. Let's go to the Caribbean Sea, which for centuries was dominated by Spain and was the heart of the Spanish ability to raise funds out of the colonies. Next slide. Today, the beating heart of the Caribbean is the Panama Canal, run very competently by the Panamanians. An enormous amount of U.S. trade, upper right, flows through that Panama Canal. And there are challenges in the Caribbean Sea. Narcotics, upper left, that's cocaine being collected by our Coast Guard partners. Gangs, bottom right, natural disaster, waves of them. And bottom left, we have refugee challenges here as well. This is, by the way, a drug bust. This is actually a very hopeful picture. We're catching a drug runner. This is a high-tech U.S. Navy vessel capturing a drug runner. Here's the bad news. The high-tech U.S. Navy vessel is the one on top. The one on the bottom that looks like Batman's submarine, that was built by the drug cartels in Colombia. When we caught this thing, and truth in advertising, there's a Navy destroyer just outside the photograph. When we caught this thing, it had 10 tons of cocaine, 10 tons. Street value, Los Angeles, $150 million. So this flow of narcotics through the region, as well as the political instability around that Caribbean, but because of maritime operations, will continue to be a challenge. Next, please. Fortunately, we have good partners in the Coast Guard who work on this, we the Navy. Next slide. So let's go to the high north. Let's go to the Arctic Ocean. This, by the way, on the left is a Navy research vessel from the 19th century, the USS Jeannette, which foundered, frozen in the ice, its crew lost about 150 years ago. The Arctic, for many centuries, was unknown until these explorations in the 19th and early 20th century. This is what's happening in the Arctic today. The ice is melting. I'm not here to have a debate about global warming. I'll just make an observation as a mariner who has sailed these waters for 4 decades. The ice is melting. As a result, these shipping lanes are going to open. That will create competition between Russia, which has about 50% of the Arctic coastline, and 5 NATO nations that have the other side: United States, Canada, Denmark by virtue of Greenland, Iceland, and Norway. Geopolitical competition is headed north. Next, please. Fortunately, we have an international organization, the Arctic Council, that will help mediate this. But In summary, as you look at the Arctic, I have to tell you, we are headed toward a new, pun intended, Cold War in the Arctic. Let's try and avoid it using organizations like this. We need more icebreakers. How many icebreakers do you think the United States has? One that actually works. We have one that's in the yards. Denmark, that small nation of 5 million, has 6 icebreakers. Russia has dozens. China, which last time I checked had no Arctic footprint, operates 10 icebreakers. This is the competition in the high north. That will be part of the geopolitics of the ocean. Next, please. So let me close our little voyage around the world by saying, let's stop for one moment and look at all the oceans together and talk about the outlaw sea, the way that the oceans are a crime scene. The oceans are the largest crime scene in history. On the oceans, we see pollution, piracy, overfishing, underreported fishing, illegal fishing, endless dumping of plastics. There is a sea of plastics in the center of the Pacific Ocean that is almost as large as the state of Texas. There is a great deal, next slide, of this pollution affecting fishing catch, which is a principal source of protein around the world. Fish stocks down 60% in the last 2 decades. And what I worry about the most strategically on the environment is the acidification of the oceans, which will lead inexorably to a diminution of the ability to conduct photosynthesis. That's where 70% of our oxygen comes from. Next slide. So right about now, you ought to say, okay, Admiral, a lot of challenges out there. We just sailed around the world in 10 minutes. What do you think? Next slide. What can we do about it? What are the opportunities to try and manage the role of the United States in this water world around us? So the most important thing we can do, I'll show you in 1 second. And you're thinking, okay, the next slide is going to be like a big aircraft carrier coming right at me. Nope. The most important thing we can do is to listen better. Listen better. And I mean listen to the oceans environmentally, listen to our allies and partners like those represented here today, listen to our own opponents politically in the country. We need to engender a better culture of listening to others so we can learn and build intellectual capital to understand the importance of the oceans. What else can we do? We can do exactly what you're doing here today. This is the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. It's a library. This is the old library, like the library right here. After listening, the next important thing we can do is to read, to learn, to build intellectual capital, to have fact-based conversations about what is happening with regard to our oceans. What else can we do? Next, please. We can hold on to our values. Our values matter. This value proposition comes to us from the ancient Greeks, upper left, the ancient Asians, upper center, through the Enlightenment, that's the young Voltaire, through our founding fathers, to highly principled leaders like Angela Merkel. I would argue the most principled, value-driven leader in the world today. We need to own our values because how we work in the oceans will reflect how we think about geopolitics, trade, and the environment. Next, please. We should also do some more reading. We've got a wonderful bookstore here. This is a book talk. I know you do dozens of these. I welcome fellow readers to an event like this because through reading, we can learn. And reading should be biography of great, in the case of the oceans, great admirals like Admiral Nimitz, novels like The Cruel Sea. If you want to read a beautiful, heartbreaking novel about the sea, read The Cruel Sea by Nicholas Montserrat. Rules of the Game about the Battle of Jutland Bottom left, going all the way back, Thucydides, and the naval battles between Athens and Sparta 2,500 years ago. By the way, I put The Economist up there. People ask me sometimes, what's the antidote to fake news? We could have a long debate about it, but the one-word answer is The Economist. It's a magazine, comes out once a week. It is principled, centrist, utterly accurate. We all need to find news like that in these challenging times about the oceans and everything else. Do we still need this? Yes. There is the aircraft carrier. We still need a strong, capable U.S. Navy. We have 275 ships today, 275. Under President Reagan, we had 600 ships. We need, at a minimum, 350 ships, 350. That's not Admiral Stavridis' number. That's a well-known, well-researched, scholar-driven assessment of the world today. We need 350. So we need a highly capable fleet. But we also need our maritime partners. We need a strong Coast Guard. We need a strong U.S. Marine Corps alongside the U.S. Navy. And we need our allies. We need our allies with us. We don't have to do this alone. The oceans are big. The United States has 275 ships. Our European allies in NATO, these flags, have 400 ships, more than the United States. Working together in coalitions like this takes the burden off of us. This is a photograph of a piracy operation. These are French Marines. They've been landed by an Italian helicopter, was refueled by a Danish frigate with a Portuguese aircraft overhead providing cover, operating from intelligence from U.S. satellites. We need a strong Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, but we also need strong allies who will operate with us. Another example of allies working together could be in the South China Sea, where we will look for Japan, South Korea, Australia to help us challenge China's growing aggression. We also need a unified global approach. The United Nations has a treaty, a big treaty. It's called the Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United States, for a variety of reasons, has not signed that treaty. We should do so because 182 other nations have signed it. It is a way to manage the oceans. So we need international involvement alongside our military allies. We need more of this. Hospital ships, disaster relief can come very effectively from the sea. I deployed this ship, ordered its deployment in the Caribbean Sea when I was the commander of Southern Command. Did extraordinary work. We had allies from 6 different nations operating on this hospital ship with us. We need private-public partnership. This is a private vessel refueling from a U.S. Navy oiler. And so I think if we do all of those things together, we have our best chance at creating a vision and a future for the United States with these oceans. It won't be smooth. There will be choppy seas. And I'll close my presentation by simply pointing out that things can go terribly wrong. You've probably read about the collision of the Fitzgerald U.S. Navy ship and a merchant ship. Those are the 7 sailors who died 4 days ago. That's the destroyed side of the Fitzgerald. This I put in front of you to remind us that it's a dangerous, complex world in the oceans. I sailed it for 37 years. If you added up all the days I spent at sea together, it adds up to 11 years at sea on the deep ocean. These young sailors died sailing that sea, defending their country. And by the way, of those 7 sailors, 4 of them born outside the United States. Here's a news flash. Immigration helps us over time. Next, please. So I'll close by saying, again, thank you for spending some time with me. I love the oceans of the world, and sometimes people ask me, what can I do to help the oceans? One thing you can do is just appreciate them. You're all lucky you live here in California. You get to see beautiful, beautiful sunsets. Spend some time looking at the oceans, thinking about the oceans. I hope you have a chance to read Sea Power. And I thank you for coming out today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. We do have time for a couple of questions, and then the Admiral has graciously agreed to autograph some books. They're for sale down the colonnade. You can't miss them. Be sure to pick one up. Our first question.
Admiral, what are our options in the South China Sea? And also, if there's a climate change continuing, will some of these islands and reefs be underwater anyway?
Yes, I'll take the second part of the question first because it's the easiest. As the polar ice melts, sea levels are rising, and Pacific islands like Vanuatu are already awash and are going to go underwater. Our own ports are going to require billions of dollars of remediation to solve that problem over the decades to come. It's yet another reason we need to focus on the environment. In terms of what are our options in the South China Sea, we need better work with our allies and partners. China will listen more if confronted with a network of Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, our allies, partners, and friends. We need to collectively go to China and say, your claims are not legally framed. We're not going to recognize them. And over time, hope we can change China's views. Secondly, we can continue to operate forward, not withdraw, not create a vacuum. Our ships, but also our allies operating forward. And number three, we should use our tools of diplomacy, our tools of economic leverage with China in order to convince them that their best approach is to recognize these are high seas, international waters. And fourth and finally, we should confront China where we must on the South China Sea, but we should cooperate where we can with China. We should look for zones of cooperation. If we have that mix of hard power and soft power, I think we have the best chance of avoiding a real confrontation with China. Looks like we got a cadet with a question.
We have 13-year-old Kyle, a cadet from San Diego. Kyle, what's your question?
My question is, as a Sea Cadet, what should I do to further my leadership and as a
Great
be a
question.
better leader?
Thank you, Kyle. Question was, what can I do as a young man to work on my leadership skills? Number one, you should listen to your mom and dad. I bet just looking at you in that uniform, I know you're coming from a great family. That's a huge advantage in life. Pay attention. Number two, you can learn from your experiences, Kyle. You're going to make some mistakes along the road of life, but the measure of anybody, just like it was of President Nixon, is not, are you perfect? It's how you learn from your mistakes. So number two is get ready to fail a few times, but try and learn from it. Number three is read some good books about leaders and leadership. And for somebody your age, I would recommend a book called Gates of Fire. Gates of Fire. It's a book about leadership. And I hope you spend a fair amount of time reading, because reading will help you be a better leader. And number four, and finally, I could go on for a while, but we'll stop with four, be physically fit. Good leaders have energy. Good leaders stay in shape. Good leaders take care of their health. Be that kind of leader as well. There's some ideas to get you started. Give me a round of applause for Kyle. Thank you. Good. Others?
Back of the room, sir.
Thank you, sir. Could you talk about a little more about the Indian Ocean? I know you've you believe the importance of the Indian Ocean in the future century?
I can. Let's start with a fundamental proposition. When a historian 500 years from now writes the history of the 21st century, I believe he or she will not be focusing on the rise of China. He or she will focus on the rise of India. China is an incredibly important nation. It will be a fundamental geopolitical force through this century. And we all saw that coming. India, we have not focused on. In 5 years, India will overtake China in population. India has English as a lingua franca that helps it connect around the world. India has a young, demographically young population, enormous advantage. China is aging rapidly and has a significant imbalance between men and women, too many men, too few women. India, on the other hand, is young, vibrant, and growing. India has many problems over the next 5 or 10 years: corruption, lack of sanitation, lack of education. But long term, I would bet on India, principally because of their demographics and because they're a democracy. In the last election, India had 860 million voters. We have a population of 340 million. We had 200 million eligible voters. We managed to get 100 million people to the polls. India had 860 million people vote. That's a powerful gift for a nation because it allows you to change leaders like a safety valve when tension builds up. So with that as preamble, my view is that as India expands its ability, it will look for partners. It will seek to have significant influence through this Indian Ocean. There are no viable challengers to India in the Indian Ocean. Closest would be Pakistan, which is really land-centric, and Iran, but the odds of them working together are small. India's massive. And then third and finally, there are enormous hydrocarbons in the Indian Ocean, which technology will allow India principally to harvest. So when you put that package together, I think India will, and therefore the Indian Ocean, will be of principal importance. I'll close by saying the biggest nautical exercise of recent years conducted between the United States, Japan, and India. That combination, those three nations, are a very capable maritime trio, and I think can bring about a connection between the deep Pacific and the Indian Ocean that will further pull the Indian Ocean into global politics. Thank you. Great question.
Sir,
Others?
back row to your right.
Sir, as a former Aegis TAO, I really like your focus on the big blue ocean threat from China and Russia. I was wondering, how do you see the role of sea power in regard to our long-term counterterrorism strategy?
First of all, I don't want to scare people. How many people here have been on a cruise liner? I'm going to guess, oh, yeah, a lot. Great. And it's a wonderful experience. Here's the bad news. Those cruise liners are increasingly vulnerable to terrorist attack. And if you think about terrorism as it's evolved, it has been land-centric, bombs and knives and attacks ashore. And we've seen attacks from the air, famously 9/11. We really haven't seen terror go to sea. I think, unfortunately, there is a distinct possibility that we're going to see terror applied at sea against cruise liners, or a rogue nation like North Korea use a container to move a nuclear weapon here. If you're Kim Jong-un, at the end of the day, you probably don't want to fire a missile with a nuke because we're going to know where it came from. You're more likely going to figure out a way to get it in a container and move it here. So defending ourselves on that vector is going to be vitally important. It will require the closest of coordination between our intelligence agencies, our international partners, our Coast Guard operating not just defensively on our coast, but actually operating in ports that are sending cargoes here. It depends on technology to more carefully understand what's in those containers, and it also means training our merchant crews on these cruise ships to defend themselves at sea. So unfortunately, I think terrorism inevitably will go to sea. It's often said that 9/11 was not a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. We need to begin imagining this idea of terror going to sea. Others? Yes,
Right
sir.
here, middle section.
You hold the mic? Scare me. My question is going back to the Chinese islands that are under construction right now. First of all, how many are there? And beyond the whole question of negotiation, collaboration, et cetera, when, if ever, do you apply force?
There are about a dozen significant installations right now comprising about 3,000 acres. So just to give you a point of comparison, a U.S. aircraft carrier is 8 acres. So if you think of these as kind of little aircraft carriers parked all around the South China Sea, 3,000 acres. So it's quite a project. It's ongoing. And in terms of applying force, we're not there yet because of the way international law works. In international law, because there's no supreme authority, international law is formed by the custom and practice of nations. So when China builds these islands, they're trying to demonstrate that we own this territory. When we drive right through them and go right along the edges of them, showing that there is no territorial sea around them, we are demonstrating under international law the custom and practice of nations are rejecting these as territorial land masses and therefore rejecting the territorial claim. We are not yet at the point where we need to do that with force because China has not yet tried to stop us from conducting these so-called freedom of navigation patrols. Again, our best course of action is diplomacy, economics, finding zones of cooperation. At some point, if China absolutely manifests this claim, then I could see we would have a higher possibility of a steel-on-steel encounter. We're not there yet. Let's hope we don't get to that point. Others?
Back row to your left, sir.
Hi, Admiral, I imagine the answer to this question is in your book, but since I have you here.
All of these are in the book, but yeah, keep going.
So if I recall correctly, the last great naval battle, which is also the naval battle in which the United States took the heaviest casualties, was Okinawa, at which point Japan had no navy, but air-based aircraft caused a lot of casualties, including the kind of precursor to airship missiles, the kamikaze.
Right.
And it's now 70 years later, and it just seems like air offensive capabilities have improved a lot more than sea capabilities. So how can we actually expect in the next war that, you know, the Navy would last very long?
Yeah. Let me bring you a little closer to the present and point to a medium-sized naval battle fought by the British against the Argentines in the Falkland Islands in the early 1980s. The British sailed a flotilla down there to win back the Falkland Islands. The Argentines launched a very aggressive land-based air campaign. The Argentines managed to sink a handful of British ships, but the British were able to use both defensive counter-air. They used their submarines to take out Argentine ships that were launching cruise missiles. And generally in that battle about 30 years ago, we saw the balance between air power and sea power still favored air power and the carrier-based approach. I think your question is on point. where are we today in that balance, especially as hypersonic, super high-speed cruise missiles come online that can threaten our carriers. My own judgment is that the balance still tips slightly to the ability to operate these carriers, which have enormous defensive capability and are covered by land-based air overhead. Their own fighters protect them. They're surrounded by Aegis destroyers. They're quite tough as targets. They also move 1,000 miles in the course of a day, so they're not stationary targets. So granting your point that the threats are rising, my judgment is that the carrier-centric approach is still slightly ahead. We need to be very mindful of it. We need to consider how we can distribute our firepower to other ships, and we're doing all of that. But at the moment, I would still rather have my hand of cards, a dozen nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, than, for example, the Chinese hand of cards, an aggressive ability to attack those carriers. I'd rather take those carriers still, but we ought to watch that space.
Admiral to the right.
Sir, very nice job so far.
Well, thank you. I'll try to wrap it up because you're the last question.
Okay. On that last question, if you had a chance to go to 350 or 400 ships, how would you do it? What would you build? Or what does our armada look like?
Sure. 360 ships would be my number. And unfortunately, you have to remember that if you have 360 ships, 120 of them, 1/3, are in the shipyard. They're being overhauled, modernized. These ships require a lot of maintenance. So you take 1/3 of them off the table, and another third, about another 120, are in training. They're working up, practicing, learning. And so to move 120 ships forward, you got to have that 360 number. So I come up with 120 ships forward by saying I need 4 aircraft carriers and all their support ships, and I would put one in the South Central Pacific, South China Sea, one in Northeast Asia, one in the Arabian Gulf, and one in the Atlantic, so it could swing into the Med, the Baltic Sea, or up to the Arctic. 4 carriers, you build the support system for it, and alongside those 4 carriers, let's not forget our U.S. Marine Corps, we need 4 big amphibious ships that can move those Marines. Increasingly, those 4 ships have unmanned vehicles, unmanned aircraft that can support the Marines from the flight decks of those kind of mini carriers, if you will. I'd put the ring around those. And then you need 12 ballistic missile submarines for long-range ballistic missiles, the ultimate strategic deterrence. And you need 60 total attack boats, submarines that can go forward. Again, of those 60, that means 20 submarines operating forward. So when you put all that together, that 120 has the balance that I just indicated. Your logistics, refueling, all that is parked in the ready reserve in the Military Sea Lift Command. That's the logistic support. What I'm describing for you, sir, is the use of the 360. That's the right number of ships for this nation. I'm very happy to see the Trump administration indicating that they will support that because it's the right mix for American power to have that level of sea power if we're going to succeed. Thank you very much. Chris?
Admiral, thank you. Ladies
What a
and gentlemen.
pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you all.